Have you ever wondered how a simple idea, a social label, can morph into a life or death legal classification? Today, we're diving deep into the history of Rwanda to understand exactly that. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a powerful lesson about identity, power, and how societies can be reshaped for better or for worse. Before European colonizers arrived in the late 19th century, Rwandan society was complex, but fluid. The terms Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa existed, but they weren't the rigid, ethnic categories we think of today. They were more like social or economic classes. A Hutu, who was primarily a cultivator, could accumulate wealth primarily in cattle, and over time, their family could become known as Tutsi. Conversely, a Tutsi family that lost its wealth might eventually be considered Hutu. These identities were porous. You could move between them. They were descriptions of your role in society, not a definition of your very being. The Twa were a smaller group, known as potters and hunter-gatherers, and were more distinct, but even then, the lines weren't drawn in permanent ink. The central authority was the Mwami, the king, who ruled over all Rwandans, regardless of their social standing. People identified primarily with their clan and their region, under the unifying rule of the kingdom. Then, everything changed. In the late 1800s, German, and later Belgian, colonizers arrived. They brought with them their own 19th-century European ideas about race and ethnicity. They looked at Rwandan society and, through a deeply flawed lens, tried to make sense of it. They became fascinated with what's known as the Hamitic hypothesis. This was a racist theory, now completely debunked, which claimed that a supposedly superior, taller, lighter-skinned Hamitic people from the north had brought civilization to Africa. The colonizers wrongly applied this theory to Rwanda. They saw the Tutsi, who were on average taller and had more aquiline features, as these supposed Hamitic invaders. They decided the Tutsi were a superior, naturally aristocratic race destined to rule, while the Hutu were the supposedly inferior Bantu natives. This wasn't just an academic theory, it had devastating real-world consequences. The Belgians began to formalize these divisions. They favored the Tutsi minority, placing them in positions of power within the colonial administration, the educational system, and the economy. They systematically excluded the Hutu majority from these opportunities. The flexible social system of the past was being dismantled and replaced with a rigid, racial hierarchy. The colonizers measured people's noses and height to scientifically determine their race. They looked at people's family histories and occupations. What was once a fluid social status was now being treated as a fixed biological trait, passed down through generations. The single most decisive step in this process came in 1933. The Belgian colonial administration conducted a census and issued mandatory identity cards to every single Rwandan. These cards explicitly stated the holder's ethnicity or ethnicity, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This was the moment of crystallization. A social idea had now become a legal, government-enforced reality. Your identity was no longer something that could shift with your fortune or social role. It was now printed on a document you had to carry with you at all times. It determined where you could go to school, what job you could get, and how the state treated you. This piece of paper transformed a social construct into an inescapable legal classification. It was a brand. This system of ethnic identification, created and enforced by the Belgians, planted the seeds of immense resentment and division. The Hutu majority felt oppressed and disenfranchised, not by their fellow Rwandans in a traditional sense, but by a colonial system that had elevated a minority based on a racist ideology. When winds of independence began to blow across Africa in the 1950s, the political landscape in Rwanda shifted dramatically. The Belgians, seeing the tide turning, suddenly switched their allegiance. They began to support the Hutu majority, framing them as the rightful democratic leaders, in a cynical move to maintain influence after independence. This switch ignited what is known as the Hutu Revolution from 1959 to 1961. It was a period of intense political and social violence. Hutu activists, fueled by decades of resentment, rose up against the Tutsi elite and the monarchy. Thousands of Tutsis were killed, and hundreds of thousands were forced to flee into exile in neighboring countries. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the new government was dominated by Hutu leaders. But tragically, They didn't dismantle the system of ethnic division. Instead, they inverted it. They kept the ethnic identity cards. Now, it was the Tutsis who were systematically discriminated against. They were seen as foreign invaders, disloyal, and a threat to the Hutu-led state. The very tools of division created by the colonizers were now being used by the newly independent government. This cycle of violence and discrimination, rooted in these legally enforced identities, continued for decades. The Hutu-led governments portrayed all Tutsis, including those who had never left Rwanda, as accomplices of the exiles who wanted to reclaim power. This constant dehumanization and political propaganda created a deeply polarized society. The identity card, that small piece of paper, became a powerful weapon. It was a simple, quick way to identify the enemy. When extremist Hutu power ideology took hold in the early 1990s, it built upon this foundation of hate. The propaganda became more extreme, painting Tutsis not just as political opponents, but as cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. All of this culminated in the horrific events of 1994. Following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana, Hutu extremists launched a meticulously planned genocide against the Tutsi population. For 100 days, the country descended into unimaginable horror. The identity cards were instrumental in the killing. At roadblocks set up across the country, militias would demand to see people's cards. If the card said Tutsi, it was a death sentence. Neighbors turned on neighbors, friends on friends. The identity that had been artificially hardened and legally enforced by the Belgians decades earlier became the primary tool for carrying out the genocide. Over 800,000 people, mostly Tutsis but also moderate Hutus who opposed the killing, were murdered. After the genocide was ended by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a rebel army led by Tutsi exiles, the new government faced an immense challenge. How do you rebuild a nation torn apart by ethnic hatred? One of the very first and most significant decisions they made was to completely abolish the ethnic identity cards. They removed any mention of ethnicity from official documents. The government's new policy was one of national unity. The official narrative became, "We are all Rwandans." The focus shifted from what divided people to what united them. Talking about Hutu or Tutsi identity became a taboo, a painful reminder of the past. The goal was to forge a new, singular Rwandan identity, free from the ethnic labels that had caused so much destruction. Today, Rwanda is a testament to the power of reconciliation and intentional nation-building. The country has seen remarkable economic development and social stability, but the legacy of its past is complex. While the official policy promotes unity, the memories and scars of the genocide remain. The story of Rwanda is a tragic but vital reminder of how dangerous it is to turn fluid social identities into rigid, legal categories. It shows us how political powers can manipulate identity for their own gain, and how a simple piece of paper can be weaponized with devastating consequences. It teaches us to be vigilant about the labels we use, the divisions we accept, and the histories we choose to remember. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a difficult but incredibly important topic. If you found this video valuable, please give it a like and subscribe for more content that explores the complexities of our world. See you next time. What if I told you that the words Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, terms tragically linked to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, didn't always mean what we think they mean? For centuries, these weren't rigid ethnic groups, but rather fluid social and economic labels. Imagine a society where your identity could change with your fortune. That was the reality in pre-colonial Rwanda. Before European arrival, Rwanda was a kingdom ruled by a Tutsi monarchy, but the lines between groups were blurry. A Hutu, who was typically an agriculturalist, could accumulate enough cattle and wealth to become a Tutsi, who were traditionally pastoralists. A Tutsi who lost their herd could become a Hutu. The Twa were a smaller group, often potters or hunter-gatherers, living on the margins of society. It was a system based more on occupation and wealth than on some immutable, inherited ethnicity. People could and did move between these categories. Think of it less like race and more like a class system you could move in and out of. This fluidity was central to Rwandan society. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, everything changed. German, and later Belgian, colonizers arrived in Rwanda. They brought with them their own European ideas about race and ethnicity, which were very different from the Rwandan understanding. Obsessed with classifying and categorizing people, they looked at the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa and saw not fluid social classes, but distinct racial groups. They developed what's known as the Hamitic hypothesis. This was a pseudoscientific, racist theory that claimed a taller, supposedly more European-like group of people, the Hamites, had migrated into Africa and were naturally superior to the local Bantu populations. The colonizers applied this flawed logic to Rwanda. They measured people's noses, skulls, and height, and decided that the Tutsis, who were often taller and had finer features, were these supposed Hamitic invaders. They concluded that Tutsis were a superior race, naturally destined to rule over the Hutu, whom they classified as inferior Bantu people. This was a complete fabrication. Modern genetics has proven that Hutu and Tutsi people are genetically almost indistinguishable, sharing a common ancestry. But the colonial administration didn't care about facts. They embraced this racial theory because it served their interests. It was a classic divide and rule strategy. By creating a racial hierarchy and favoring one group over the other, they could maintain control more easily. So, how did they make this fiction a reality? They institutionalized it. The Belgian authorities gave the Tutsi minority preferential treatment. They were given access to education, positions in the colonial administration, and economic advantages. The Hutu majority, on the other hand, were largely excluded from power and forced into labor. The social mobility that had once defined Rwandan society was gone, replaced by a rigid, racial caste system. The most powerful tool in cementing this division was the identity card. In 1935, the Belgian colonial government introduced a system of mandatory national identity cards for every Rwandan. And on these cards, next to your name and date of birth, was a new, crucial piece of information: your ethne, or ethnicity. Every single person was officially and permanently labeled as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This wasn't a choice. It wasn't based on your wealth or job. It was based on your father's identity. If your father was registered as Hutu, you were Hutu for life. If he was Tutsi, you were Tutsi for life. There was no changing it. A social distinction that had once been fluid was now legally enforced, inherited, and an inescapable part of your identity. You carried your label with you everywhere, a constant reminder of the box you'd been put in. This one act, the introduction of the ethnic identity card, had devastating consequences. It transformed a social construct into a legal and biological-seeming reality. It bred decades of resentment and animosity. The Hutu majority felt oppressed and disenfranchised by a system that legally defined them as second-class citizens. The Tutsi minority, propped up by the colonizers, became associated with an unjust colonial power structure. The seeds of ethnic hatred were sown, watered by colonial policy. When Rwanda gained independence from Belgium in 1962, the power dynamics violently shifted. The Hutu majority, fueled by years of resentment, took control of the new government. But they didn't dismantle the system of ethnic division created by the Belgians. Instead, they weaponized it. The roles were now reversed. The new Hutu-led government began to persecute the Tutsis, using the very same ethnic labels and identity cards to identify, marginalize, and attack them. The identity cards that had once elevated the Tutsis now became a death warrant. This systematic discrimination and waves of violence culminated in the horrific 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. During those 100 days, militias and ordinary citizens used those very identity cards at roadblocks to determine who would live and who would die. A simple piece of paper, a legacy of colonial racial science, became a tool for mass murder. It's a chilling example of how administrative categories, born from flawed ideas, can have catastrophic human consequences. After the genocide, the new Rwandan government, led by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, made a radical decision. They abolished the ethnic identity cards. They understood that to rebuild the nation and create a unified Rwandan identity, they had to destroy the tool that had so effectively torn it apart. Today, identifying someone publicly as Hutu or Tutsi is not just taboo, it's against the law. The government promotes a singular national identity, Ndi Umunyarwanda, which means I am Rwandan. The focus is on shared nationality, not divisive ethnic labels. This is a conscious effort to heal the wounds of the past and ensure that such a tragedy can never happen again. The story of Rwanda's identity cards is a powerful and tragic lesson. It shows how identity is not always natural or inherent but can be constructed, manipulated, and imposed. It reveals how simple administrative tools can be used to create deep social divisions, and how dangerous pseudoscience can be when it's wielded by power. Rwanda's journey is a stark reminder of the long shadow of colonialism and a testament to the nation's ongoing effort to forge a new, unified identity from the ashes of a divided past. Thank you for watching. If you found this history insightful, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.